Lots of you might be wondering between Sony FX30 and a Sony A7IV because of the similar price. So which one to get? Sony FX30 with the aps-c sensor and 4K up to 120 FPS recording for about $1,800, or maybe the Sony A7IV with full frame sensor but with only 60 FPS in 4K for about $2,500. Well, it depends. Hey everyone, mariuszgajdzik here, and thanks to the fact that I work with Sony Poland on creating Sony Alpha Academy content, I was able to work with Sony FX30 as well as the Sony A7IV. So today I'm gonna compare those two and try to tell you what to look for when you're choosing between them. As I mentioned, Sony Poland here and their Sony Alpha Academy, I will mark this video as an advertisement. However, they didn't ask me to make it. I'm making it because I want to, and they didn't have any input or they didn't see it before it was posted. Okay, having that out of the way, let's start. The biggest difference, of course, is the sensor, where Sony FX30 has an aps-c sensor with 26 megapixels, where it gives us 6K over sampling to 4K. However, because it is a smaller sensor, aps-c sensor, it will have a little bit less of a nice image quality, and it will have a smaller dynamic range because of the size of the sensor. However, the Sony A7IV has a full frame sensor, which is 33 megapixels. It will give us a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit better image quality thanks to 7K downsampling to the 4K, and it will give us better low light performance when it comes to higher ISOs. But the advantage of the aps-c sensor for the Sony FX30 will be smaller and cheaper lenses. So if you have aps-c lenses or you wanna have a cheaper and smaller system, that might be advantage for you. However, on the A7IV we can also switch on the aps-c mode and use the camera as it was aps-c, so we can actually use the aps-c lenses on the A7IV too. But the full frame lenses are gonna give us nicer range, much wider angles, and they're gonna give us nicer background blur. The downside to that is that the lenses for full frame are bigger and much more expensive. The cameras have the same codecs, HAVC-S, HAVC-SI, and HAVC-HS, but Sony FX30 is gonna allow us to film in 4K up to 120 frames per second in 422 10-bit and up to 240 frames per second in HD. But with the 120 frames per second, we're gonna have additional crop, and it's gonna be 1.5 times crop. So we have to take that in mind if we want to have a wider angle in 120 or 100 FPS on the FX30. And on A7IV we can shoot 4K up to 60 FPS with 1.5 times crop, so it's basically similar to what we have on the FX30. If we put 60mm lens on the FX30, we're gonna get about 24mm focal length on the 4K 60, and the same with the A7IV. We're gonna have that 1.5 crop, so 16 is becoming about 24mm on the A7IV in 4K 60, but we can record 4K 25 without the crop, so we can still have that 60mm in 4K 25, 24, and 30, I believe. And in the Sony A7IV in HD we can record up to 120 FPS without the crop, but only in 8-bit 420. So if we want to film in 422 10-bit, it's gonna be up to, I think, 60 FPS on HD. Both of the cameras have a nice colors with the S-Log 3, 10-bit 422 like I've mentioned before. If we wanna film in S-Log 3, that's perfectly fine. However, the Sony FX30 is gonna be nicer matching to the FX3, FX6, and FX9. It has a much more similar color to those cameras than the Sony A7IV, which has a color similar to the other photo cameras from Sony. Both of the cameras have a really nice autofocus. I never had any issue with using the autofocus on FX30 as well as the A7IV. They both have human, animal, and bird IIF, so no difference here. However, in specs, the A7IV has a better autofocus with more AF points and a little bit more of sensitivity when it comes to AF. They also both have IBIS in-body image stabilizer, and we can use standard, which works okay. Not crazy about it, but it helps a little bit. It's much better using IBIS than not using IBIS. But we also have active image stabilization, and if you want to use that, you can use that. They work pretty similar on both cameras, but you cannot use them with the highest frame rates, which already has a crop, because the active stabilization acts a little bit of the additional crop to stabilize the footage. FX30 has a dual gain ISO of 800 and 2500, and the A7 IV has a dual gain ISO of 800 and 3200. Where the A7 IV is going to be much better for low light because of the larger sensor. Full frame sensor compared to aps-c is going to be better for low light. It's going to give us much nicer image on higher ISOs. However, it is a little bit different when it comes to rolling shutter. Here, the smaller sensor, the aps-c sensor of the FX30, is going to give us better rolling shutter than the A7 IV sensor, which is bigger sensor with more megapixels, so harder readout for the processor of the camera. The FX30 has a cinema line design or layout, so you have the buttons that are labeled with the video functions, so that's gonna let you use the camera easier for filming. You're gonna have all the options basically under your fingers on the buttons, so if you wanna use the camera quicker, that's gonna be a major factor when it comes to that. And the A7 IV is more like a photo camera with the ability to film, so all the buttons are gonna be photo buttons on the A7 IV and video buttons on the FX30. However, on the A7 IV you can customize those buttons and put those same functions to those buttons. They're just not gonna be labeled to them, so you're gonna have to remember what's what. And here you have those labels, so you can easily kind of look at it and see that this is gonna do zebra, this is gonna do peaking, and etc, etc. So it's easier to film with the Sony FX30 when it comes to like usability than the A7 IV, because A7 IV is basically a photo camera. The FX30 is a video camera, so this is set up for video, this is set up for photo, but you can film with both. It's just going to be easier on the FX30 than the A7 IV. When it comes to weight, there's not much difference. The Sony FX30 is 646 grams and the A7 IV is 658 grams. So like I said, not much difference. Ports are the same on both cameras. We have the microphone mini jack, headphone mini jack, USB-C, micro USB, and a full-size HDMI. And with the FX30, with this full-size HDMI, we can have 16-bit RAW output, which is gonna let us film ProRes RAW with the Atomos Ninja. And on the A7 IV, we're not gonna have ability to film ProRes RAW. We're just gonna get the output for ProRes. The FX30 also has active cooling, so if you wanna record for longer times, you're gonna be having much better peace of mind with the FX30, because of that active cooling, that camera shouldn't really ever overheat. But the A7 IV I've used for recording for up to like 2 hours or more, and never had the issue of overheating or even showing overheating. When it comes to the card slots, the FX30 wins here again. It has 2 ports that takes both CF Express Type A and the SD cards, whereas the A7 IV only has 1 port for CF Express Type A and SD, and the other port is SD only. So if you want to use that CF Express Type A cards, you're going to be able to use 2 at the same time in the FX30 and only 1 in the A7 IV. They both have the same battery, NPF Z100 battery, and I think that battery is pretty good. I'm not going to get into it too much. FX3 can be bought with the XLR unit, where we pay $400 extra. And we can use that unit as a top handle, so it's a top handle XLR unit. So for the FX30 with the top handle XLR unit, we pay about $2,200, and with the Sony A7 IV we can also use that with the K3M unit, but that's gonna cost us additional $600. But also with that we get extra mic, so the price is pretty similar over here, but you might not need a mic, you might have a mic already, so you know, you need to figure out yourself what you prefer. And it's basically the same unit, it just doesn't have that top handle that the unit for the FX30 has. The Sony FX30 has a screen with 2.36 million dots, which is better than the screen of the A7 IV with the 1.04 million dots. But the Sony A7 IV also has a viewfinder, so if you use viewfinder, if you used to use a new viewfinder, like using the A7S3 and using the viewfinder there, you might be considering the A7 IV over the FX30, which doesn't have that, because that viewfinder is going to be definitely beneficial for many users in many situations. FX30 also has that new menu and interface we first saw in the FX3 with the update to 2.0. Which I made a video about, and you can see it somewhere over here. I never remember which side is it. However, the Sony A7 IV has a mode dial where you can easily switch from photo to video to SNQ, and I like that a lot with my Sony A7 IV, which I use alongside my FX3, because I can easily switch between those modes, and it helps me a lot when hybrid shooting, like when shooting photos and needing to switch to video or SNQ. And along with that new interface with the Sony FX30, you get the log shooting modes, Cine EI, Quick Cine EI, Flexible ISO or off. You can choose between those and you easily shoot in S-Log with the base ISOs. Comparing to the regular method of shooting S-Log with the picture profile in the A7 IV with basically any ISO you want to choose instead of just choosing the base ISO, which provides you with the best quality you can get at that ISO. So basically you just need to choose which method you prefer over here. The Cine is definitely easier to work with the base ISOs, but you can still achieve the same with the A7 IV shooting an S-Log free with the regular method that we used to use in our previous cameras. And on both cameras you can still shoot the S-Cine tone, like on the A7 IV you can choose it as a picture profile, and on the FX3 you can also do that. The FX30 however is limited for photography. It doesn't have a mechanical shutter, so you won't be able to shoot with flash, you won't be able to shoot continuous shooting, and you won't be able to shoot long exposures. So that's a shame because it has a 26 megapixel sensor, which would be nice to do photos on that. However, we don't have that because it's a video camera first, and the A7 IV has all that functions because it's a photo camera. They both have lens bleeding compensation, focus map, and ability to use as a webcam with USB-C streaming. So to summarize, the FX30 is a great camera for those who want the camera for filmmaking, primary for filmmaking. They don't care about photos, they don't care about the functions for photos, and they might want to do long recordings because of that active cooling is gonna give them much nicer peace of mind when it comes to that longer recordings. And maybe they have aps-c lenses because they're switching from the A6400, A6000, maybe A6600, and they just want to upgrade for nicer video, and they have a lot of lenses. And also a big advantage over here is going to be a much better matching to cinema line cameras like FX3, FX6 or FX9. But summarizing the A7 IV, this is going to be a best camera for hybrid shooters, so people like me, people who shoot photo and video. So if you want to shoot video and photo, A7 IV is really good camera for that. You still have the 4K 60 FPS. Okay, it has a crop, the 1.5 times crop, which is pretty much the same as the crop on the FX30. So if you don't care for that 120 FPS and you have like aps-c lenses and you want to use them, you can still use them on the A7 IV. And the 120 FPS on the FX30 aren't actually that good in my opinion. They have additional 1.5 times crop. Unless you like that and unless you can work around that, if you know that limits and you don't care about those limits. But otherwise, I feel like if you don't need that 120 FPS, and I have that in my FX3 and I pretty much don't use that at all. So I have a camera which is able to shoot 120 FPS in 1.1 crop, not 1.5. So it's pretty much wide angle, full frame, 120 FPS, and I really don't use that because it is just not something that I need in my videos I made for my clients or for YouTube over here. So keep that in mind if you're choosing between those two cameras and you want to have that 120 FPS. Just ask yourself a question if you really need that, and if you need that 120 with the 1.5 times crop, because I don't think like you actually might need that. And the A7IV, because of that full frame sensor, is gonna give you a better quality image. It's gonna give you wider dynamic range. It's gonna give you nicer high ISO image as well. So you might be considering something that you probably not gonna use over actually getting a nicer image. And in my opinion, the Sony A7IV, for my choice as a second camera to the Sony FX3, is a nicer camera than the Sony FX30, but your choice might be different because you might be choosing on different needs. So I think this is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in that video. If you liked it, please leave it a like, subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any of my future content similar to this one. I would also love if you check out my Instagram, where I try to post daily about my photography, filmmaking, photos, videos, reels, stories, etc, etc. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope I will see you in the next one. Bye.